To be a successful law firm partner, I think you have to take a client into your heart. You have to almost sublimate your own ego. And I think that involves embracing the level of your own ignorance. Courage is a key attribute to success right now. Another one, fundamental to success, is...
Today's guest is Karen Seward, a former Global Head of Litigation and Executive Committee member at A&O Shearman. With over 30 years of experience in leadership, crisis management, and people strategy, Karen is now the founder of Seward Advisory Limited, offering expert strategic advice.
If you don't have a fundamental growth mindset, if you do not believe that you can go to work tomorrow and be better than you were yesterday, I'm not sure ultimately you will be successful. What you want to be as a leader is like a cold glass of water. You are partial shade on a sunny day. You do not want to be a total eclipse. And honestly, in my early career, there was too much me in the room. That is a lesson I think we all have to learn.
What key pieces of advice have you been given in your career which have had a positive or negative effect on your success?
That's quite a big question, Stephen.
Welcome to Beyond Billables, lessons from top law firm partners, a new podcast where renowned and well-known law firm partners reveal the secrets of their success. I'm Stephen Rodney, formerly co-founder of Fox Rodney Search, previously one of the leading headhunting boutiques in the last 25 years, and now founder of Integrate Coaching, where we provide tailor-made lateral integration programs for partners moving firms. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Karen Seward. Originally an employment litigation partner, Karen retired from A&O Shearman at the end of last year, having been at A&O for over 20 years. During that time, Karen held a variety of senior management positions at A&O, including being Global Head of A&O's litigation practice, being Co-Chair Americas based in New York, and being a member of A&O's Exec Committee, which was operationally responsible for running the firm. Very interestingly, for our purposes, based on the West Coast, she not only opened A&O's US offices there, but also acted as culture carrier and head of integration for the staff and lawyers she recruited to work in these new offices. She was also a key member of the deal team and the steering committee driving the merger with Shearman's. Karen is now a qualified Mailer Campbell trained coach and continues to co-head the A&O Shearman Leadership Centre, and has a strategic advisory and crisis management business, Seward Advisory Limited. During the course of 2025, she's also taken on some non-profit board positions in the arts and education sectors, which she's very passionate about. So welcome, Karen.
Hey, thank you, Stephen. You exhaust me by that description.
It could have been a lot longer as well, so I've cut it down. So Karen, look, as I said, welcome to this podcast. And it would be great if perhaps we could start off with you telling us a little bit about your journey to becoming a partner initially.
Interesting. So I grew up in Barrow-in-Furness, an isolated town in the northwest, a shipyard town, struggling with kind of post-industrial decay. It's not a town many people leave. I was quite anxious to leave. But my father worked in the shipyard. And I think I learned very early on that you can't expect life to be fair. The miners' strike back in the 80s had an enormous effect on me at the time. I was about 16 or 17 at the time. And I felt that although life isn't necessarily going to be fair, it could probably be fairer. So I think on that basis, I was really keen to study law at university, which of course everyone at our age says, oh, why didn't I study something more interesting? So I went to Bristol, did law, ended up in the city. Back then, it was like a feeder system. If you went to university to do a law degree, you got sent up to London to kind of take up a summer placement. There was not democratic like it is now. And so I eventually found my way to St. Simmons because they were the only firm at the time that did employment law. And my social conscience was really only about labour law and really wanting to kind of put things, I think, right from a discriminatory perspective. My grandmother, for example, had been forced to retire at 60 from a job that she loved, and that was a real driver for me as well. I ended up at A&O in about 2000. So I had been a law firm partner at that point at both Stevenson Harwood and Pinsent Curtis, as it then was before then. How did I become a partner? Well, honestly, Stephen, in 1996, when I became a partner at 6 years qualified, it was time of a massive expansion within the City of London. Frankly, if you didn't have two heads, you kind of got partnership.
I
So
think you're being a little bit modest.
I
there,
don't
Karen.
think so, honestly. So, but anyway, it was it was great to be at Stevenson Harwood. It was a smaller firm. I was able to, learn to be a partner there. And I think I realized, people who come from a working class background, certainly in my generations, would always talk about leaving, like escaping their working class backgrounds. And of course, you come to the city and it's very, very different, and you end up bringing your middle class self to work. But I did have an epiphany quite early on to realize, of course, you can't escape your background. It's part of you, and you have to actually play to your strengths. And I think what really served me well in that path to partnership was a real ability to communicate with all different kinds of people, and also a sense that you could be very pragmatic as a lawyer. That was quite unusual in the 80s. The paradox of employment law is it often attracts people who really like the law because it's a very techie subject, but they're not always the best people to be employment lawyers, because with being an employment lawyer, you have to deal with human relations. You have to have emotional intelligence. You have to understand that the law can only take you so far. So it was very easy, actually, based on that pragmatism and those communication skills, to be different and make a difference.
Yeah, no, I mean, that sounds amazing. Also, I met you when you were leaving Simmons to go to Stevenson Harwood.
Did you, in fact, did you place me in that firm? I think you might have done.
I think I may well have done. So there we are. I had a little part. So I think I may well have placed you in Vincent Curtis.
I think you did. Or that I do remember.
Anyway, I didn't place you at A&O, unfortunately. But okay, so that's really interesting, because actually another guest, and if you watch the podcast, his father worked in the shipyards, not too far from where you were. That's quite interesting. So what is being a successful partner from your point of view, apart from billing a lot? And how do you think the skills you possess have helped to make you that successful partner? What 3 or 4 attributes do you think there are to being successful?
That's quite a big question, Stephen. I think to be a successful law firm partner, and it has always been the case, I think you have to take a client into your heart. You have to almost sublimate your own ego to put a client first. Being a client lawyer, I think, isn't adjacent in professional life. It's got to be totally central to the way that you practice law. I understand that model is generationally challenging right now, because that isn't perhaps what people younger than me might want from their careers. But I think that it is still really, really important. But what I think is very important now is that the world is very complex, and the problems that clients have are very complex, and they're looking for aggregated solutions. And what they're looking for from their lawyer is a big conversation. They know you haven't got all the answers, but they want to have a sensible and, enlightening conversation with somebody who they will view as having something important to add into that conversation. And therefore, I think you have to engage these days with clients without necessarily knowing. And I think that involves embracing the level of your own ignorance. And that's a hard thing to do. And I think it actually requires quite a lot of courage. So I think courage is a key attribute to success right now. Another one, I think, fundamental to success is how you collaborate. Star culture or not, I think firms need people who can work together for the same reason, to enhance a client's solution. So I think what that means, that you've got to be able to run a team really well. And that in turn puts a premium, I think, on kindness and respect and inclusion, because you have to be able to get the best out of your team. You have to create an environment where people want to work together and bring their A game. So I think the skills that are really required, require you to be a unifier of culture. You've got to create fertile ground, I think, to plant seeds that will germinate. And so, we're still coming out of law schools and universities with the same technical training. And I think law firms are not really engaged in a collective way about the kind of training for the skills that you really need to be successful now.
And those skills that you've listed there, were those the skills that made you successful initially, or have you kind of metamorphosized as time has gone on?
Yeah, I think I've metamorphosized. I think you've got to learn. I think that's another key thing. If you don't have a fundamental growth mindset, if you don't believe that you can go to work tomorrow and be better than you were yesterday, I'm not sure ultimately you will be successful. You've got to look at the path you're on. For example, I think every partner is a leader. And I think I wasn't always aware of the leader's shadow. What you want to be as a leader is like a cold glass of water. You want partial shade on a sunny day. You do not want
Yeah.
to be a total eclipse. And honestly, in my early career, there was too much me in the room. And,
Right.
that is a lesson I think we all have to learn.
Yeah. Again, I can think of someone else who I've who's been on the podcast who has said similar things. So that's very interesting, those common traits. And bearing in mind you as a Simmons and then went to Stevens and then Benson Curtis, then on to A&O, they're very different kinds of law firms, even back 20 years ago.
Mhm.
So were there different attributes for success needed for those different types of law firms? And when you got to A&O, did you have to start again, really? Or was it just a continuation of what you'd already learned?
It's a really interesting question because I think although law firms are fundamentally different, I
Mm,
think successful law firms share a few common things. And I think one thing is a widely understood and constant focus on the values.
right.
All of those firms, I think, know what wine they are producing.
Mm,
And you've got to get rid of glycol if it contaminates your wine. And therefore, I think, you don't always have to do that by removing people behaviorally difficult, but you do have to remediate them in some way.
mhm,
And I think a firm with values always knows the true cost of allowing poor behavior. And I think that is fundamental to the success of a firm because those values flow down through the collaboration that I've already spoken about,
yes.
through client commitment. You've got to hold your partners in the utmost respect. It's like a
Mm,
marriage. The law sector took the partnership model for a reason.
mm,
And actually, although, people think, oh, how outdated is it? When I look at the motivations and the need for purpose and commitment from the other generations that are younger than
mm.
me, I think actually that model on the face of it is very attractive to them and it should be.
I can definitely empathize with that. And it's very interesting. You've talked about collaboration, the star culture, I think you mentioned it at some points.
Mm.
And obviously, you were at a firm and every firm has had its issues with partners who are regarded as big billing star rainmakers who perhaps don't behave in the way that one ideally like them to behave. Have you seen the attitude of law firms change to those star partners since during the time you were a partner?
Yes, I have. I mean, look, everyone wants to be the star in their own movie, and
Mm,
that's human nature. But I think that although you do need, you need partners with fantastic profile and reputation,
mm,
it's for the greater good. It's to raise the
mm,
boats of everybody around you. So there's no problem with having people within a partnership that have stellar reputations,
mm,
but they've got to be engaged at
mm.
putting it into service, not only for themselves, but for everyone else. And when you think about why laterals might fail,
Yeah.
I think
We'll talk
often,
about.
laterals come in and they fail to read the air. I always think about the UK legal market. The UK generally is a moderately high context culture. There's a lot of unsaid. There's a lot of real need. And this is where coaching comes in, of course, is
Mm,
that
mm,
ability to really understand what's being said to you when it's not being said to you and to look at people's body language. And I think
mm.
people who come into firms without a commitment to sort of shut up and listen often, I think, fail, even though they may be very, very good.
That's very, very interesting. I mean, obviously, what I'm doing now is helping people integrate into their new firms. So, when you said partners need to listen to what's going on around them,
Hmm.
how much help do you think those partners have to do that? Because a lot of lawyers don't have a high EQ quotient, and they're generally not recruited because of their EQ quotient. They're recruited because of their book of business and because of their reputation. And is it reasonable to expect those people to be able to move to a new environment and to be able to absorb the new culture without help?
I think people do need help, but I think help starts at home. And what
Okay.
I've seen with laterals is actually, I'm always surprised by laterals who join teams within a firm. They go through a recruitment process where they get
Mm,
very close with the particular team that they're
mm,
joining. And that's all great. But they haven't really thought about the culture they're joining, the firm they're
mhm,
joining. They may not have asked to talk to the COO or the managing partner or the senior partner, and they haven't done their homework, right? You need to be able to really think about what you need, how you're going to get it, who you're going to collaborate with before you join. So I think there is a lot of
mm,
work laterals fail to do that they could do. But then once inside, I agree, because it is so important to read the air. I do
mm,
think there is a role for, a 100-day coach or an integration coach. I mean, when I joined Allen and Overy, it was
Yeah.
sort of sink or swim. I mean, that was
Yeah.
just the time it was. This was back in 2000.
Mm.
Now, when I look at good law firm integration, there are lots of business plans that have been developed over the recruitment process. There's already a timetable for taking people around and meeting institutional clients. I think the challenge with billables, since we're talking about beyond billables, is often now the metrics in law firms are so tough that it cuts against somebody new coming in and the existing team walking them around them voluntarily as the client base. And you can get around that, I think, to a degree by having a proper business plan, understanding what this lateral is bringing that's additive, that's actually going to enhance the client offering. But I don't think there's enough work necessarily spent on it from a firm perspective, and certainly not like if you look at the sector as a whole.
No, well, I think the business plan's one thing, and that's prepared to get the person in, but it's the integration plan, which encompasses the business plan, but actually looks at the situation that the lateral's in when they arrive, which might be a year after they agree to join you because of notice periods and stuff. And things can be very different. And what I've found is that a lot of partners who've arrived have not realized that their internal market, so their new partners that they don't know, not in their immediate team, but outside their team, they need to treat those people as clients. They perhaps have grown up in a firm where they've just got to know their other partners. But when you're a lateral coming into a large firm, to have a plan to go to those other partners and really, get to know them. And they're not just going to give you their clients. It's just not going to happen in my experience. So people don't often.
No, I just think that's a really astute observation. I think that the problem, again, is metrics. When you come through the door of a new firm, you want to be getting those marks on the board.
I know.
And so the plan that would require you, perhaps if you're joining a global firm, to get on a plane and go around the different jurisdictions and go and see clients in different parts of the world is brilliant on paper. But does it always happen in practice? Because, you're worried that you're going to get judged. The other thing is, to the point you're making about treating other people that perhaps you've not anticipated as clients, is that I think if you find yourself triggered in that way, you've got to remember that inclusion, not exclusion, is going to create more value. I think if you're struggling to see the value of a person in front of you as a new lateral into a firm, you've got to have the self-discipline to flip that question back to yourself and say, well, if I don't see any value in you, what am I missing?
I totally agree. I think some of the issues relate to if someone's coming into a department where there are 7 or 8 partners doing the same thing. That's a very different experience to someone coming in where there is no other partner or just one other partner. And in the report that we did on lateral integration a year ago, the phrase contested space was something which was mentioned a couple of times, because you can't expect partners in the world we live in, where it's not lockstep anymore, to just kind of lift their skirts, as it were, and just invite the lateral to jump on their clients. It's not going to happen. Confused about that, because they say, well, surely those partners were involved in meeting this person before they came in, but that's not the same thing, is it?
I agree with that, and I think you can help mitigate that situation as an individual in that situation by making sure that you're not self-oriented. No one trusts anyone who thinks they're just out for themselves. You have to be humble. You have to go to a firm, you have to go to your new partners and others and ask, what can I do for you?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. We'll come back to laterals, if you don't mind, a little bit later on, because I've got some more specific questions about that, particularly your experience. One of the questions I wanted to ask you is that although you haven't worked obviously in a pure US firm, you've obviously had massive experience of helping to build up the US offices of A&O, especially as, I think your phrase, the culture carrier of the A&O culture on the West Coast. So again, apart from how much you bill, what do you see as the common attributes for success in the non-US and US firms, and where do they differ from your point of view?
It's a really good question. I think ultimately the foundation of an answer is in the culture and the willingness to understand different cultures. When you're in the business of operating in a global law firm, what you're trying to do is unite cultures, geographies, sectors, diverse people. And the only way, and I said this earlier, that you're going to get to something that's really attractive from a client perspective is how you can understand each other. And so, there is a real role for coaching, but there just is a real role for trying to understand the differences. And I think law firms are good at this. Lots of international law firms have got many, many different offices. And so there's no reason why people can't be good at this and can't really be successful. But I think, as you see some of the US firms trying to grow out in Europe, the reverse is also true. They have to perhaps change their attitude slightly. I did a course in Harvard a few years ago. It was called something portentous, like lead a law firm of the 21st century or something. But one day we got really stuck on hybrid working from home, presenteeism, all of this. And it was so fascinating because the academic who was in charge of the class, it was a class full of lawyers managing law firms, and everyone was just outraged about people not being in the office and all of the rest of it, and the osmotic potential of learning being lost. It was just a moment for the academic to say, look, people are not going to change their desire to work in a different way in 2025. How are you going to change to accommodate it? And I think that is so important.
I completely agree with you. And that's very interesting. And how did the class react when he said that?
Well, they were all tearing their hair out, of course, and I was chuckling away. But I had a reverse mentor from the LA office when I was there, and she taught me a really important lesson. She was explaining that the group that she was in required everyone to come in at 8 a.m. Now, in LA, that's quite hard because associates do not live in the swanky parts of LA where you might find law firm offices. So in order to get there for 8 o'clock, this particular associate would have to get up at 5, get on the freeway at 5:30 to make sure that the journey was 90 minutes or less so that they could then get to the office. And then what she pointed out is, of course, in COVID, we all forgot that we're teaching hospitals. And so she gets to the office and everyone is on the client call at 8 o'clock from their offices, on their screens, fully virtual. And it is incumbent upon us, and particularly on leaders of law firms, to recognize this cultural challenge. And I feel like we've only scratched the surface of the intergenerational challenge. The purpose that people are looked for now and the desire to associate with firms that are an admired brand is so important, which is why values, and I know values is having a moment right now, why the ability to, or the desire to associate with a firm will depend ultimately on whether the individual feels that the firm shares their values. Something like 63% of associates feel that they can influence law firms' stance on issues that are essentially political. So ticking a box is actually quite dangerous now. So I do think this is a huge challenge for the profession.
I'm sure it is. And in the US, because as I said, you were in a very unusual position because you had a lot of experience in the UK, then went over to the US, recruited a lot of US partners. So did you see things, actually behavioral or value issues from those US partners who joined a global firm, often from a pure US firm? Did you see things that prized you? What kind of things did you see?
Well, it's a cliche, isn't it, to say that, that bad behavior depends only on the perspective you're looking at it from. But what I think is really important, I think it was a skill that I used in abundance, was the ability to kind of sit down, call it out, try to understand, try to explain that there is something around a firm culturally that's important. That's why people join. And that no matter how great a producer you might be, there is a level of behavior that can't be tolerated. But it comes in values as well. I mean, you will see differences across the US and UK, the US, Europe, and the rest of the world in relation to, the Palestinian issue at the moment, for example, any political issue. You will find people who really have very strong views that are very different. And trying to move that forward is a very delicate thing, I think, in a law firm.
So, I mean, you mentioned the sort of bad behavior. Do you think there's a higher tolerance for, in inverted commas, bad behavior in US firms compared to non-US firms?
I wouldn't make that distinction in that way. Okay. I have been in firms where short-term reasons have determined that particularly bad behavior will not be dealt with in that moment. I mean, my view is that's always a mistake, that you break far more than a dozen eggs by tolerating poor behavior. And I wouldn't break it down in that way, Stephen. I really wouldn't. I know that it's a cliche, but I don't believe it. And some of the US partners I've worked with have been the very best culture partners I've ever seen.
Wow. Okay. That's very interesting to know. I mean, you've many management and leadership roles previously at A&O. Can we just look at that now? What, to your mind, are the attributes needed to make the transition from being a successful what I would call jobbing partner to a successful department head and a successful board member, do you think they're different from what made you a successful partner initially?
Yes, they're completely different.
Okay.
So you've got to have a growth mindset. You've got to feel you can try better and be better. My leadership role model, I've got to say this, Stephen, because I'm a diehard Liverpool fan, it will always be Jurgen Klopp. Tough love, raises the boats for everyone around him. It's really important as a leader to recognize that you've probably been promoted for reasons other than your leadership skills, and therefore to go on a leadership journey.
Okay.
And, my golden rule is always to look at a quote from Kierkegaard that says, to dare is to momentarily lose your footing, but to fail to dare is to lose yourself. And I feel that you really have just got to get over your skis as a leader. And you'll make mistakes, and Lord knows I made plenty, and you learn a lot from the mistakes you make. But what you have to do as a leader, and maybe this is a bit different as a client partner, when sometimes you have to put a different face to a different client or a different sector, and you're constantly putting yourself on show in slightly different ways. As a leader, you have to be exactly the same. Everyone has to experience you in exactly the same way. You have to look the same, whichever angle you're viewed from, because that kind of integrity and authenticity is so important. And if people think that you're doing something out of self-interest, you will never build trust. And trust is everything as a leader. And that doesn't mean that you don't deal with underperformance. You have to take the difficult parts of the job, and you have to really connect with your obligation to the partnership, the most profound obligation, whether you're a producing partner or a leader or both. You have to really put the interests of your fellow partners first. And so for me, therefore, dealing with underperformance just naturally flows out of that. And of course, you hardly ever get feedback as a leader, which I think is a problem with law firms. I always had a habit of going to bed every night and saying, did I try to make someone's life better today? You can't always say yes, but you've got to dust yourself down and the next day, go again. And you've got to have developed, I think, resilience to be in a job like that.
And did you, when you became a partner, when you joined A&O, did you think, I do want to be a leader of a law firm? Did that come to you later, or how did it work? You mentioned that you're not generally asked to be a leader for your leadership skills initially, so that was an interesting phrase.
It's a good question. I think it got to the point, and perhaps I picked quite a small area of the law, and perhaps if I'd done M&A, I might have felt a little bit differently. I certainly really enjoyed putting that deal together and helping with that. And it did make me think, well, maybe I should have gone down the corporate route rather than being a litigator. But I think
You mean the Shearman's deal?
I do.
Yeah.
I think that I got to a point where I thought I probably need to change to do something different. I've done everything that I could possibly do as an employment lawyer. And so as I was contemplating leaving the firm in search of new horizons, the thought occurred to me, well, maybe I can just slightly reinvent myself where I am and not move and not leave. And so I think that was when I first started to think about leadership. And I've been involved for a long time in partner selection at the firm. I have, I think, quite highly developed people skills. And so that was just a kind of natural to springboard off it. It was the best thing I've ever done to run for law firm leadership. And it was the absolute worst day when I didn't get it. But,
You're talking about managing partner.
I am.
Yeah.
Yes, which I ran for a few years ago now. It was such a fabulous process because, the idea was that you would really sit down, have proper conversations with your partners you hardly knew in other parts of the world. It was so inspiring. It was so energizing to feel that there was so much talent around you. So it was rather crushing to fail.
Did you do any sort of self-analysis on why you think
Of course.
I'm sure you did. So why do you think it didn't work?
If you're a provocateur, as I frequently have been in my life, and maybe that is my working class background, you have to learn how to be digestible, right? You have to learn that if you're going to blow some grenades in the air, you have to have created air pockets for the shock to be absorbed. And maybe some of those grenades fell on arid ground. So I certainly, there were things that I perhaps would do differently if I look back on it. I certainly don't feel it was one of those examples of life's unfairness that I didn't get elected. I have to take responsibility for that. Otherwise, what's the point? So I did had many moments of self-reflection. Of course, that's also a moment, when that happens in law firms, talent often leaves because you just can't face coming back through the front door. But, I was able to regroup and then have my American adventure, which was really satisfying.
Indeed. Okay, so when you've mentioned previously that when you got to A&O, it was a sort of little bit of a sink or swim for you. Is that how you found, the move to Stevens and Harwood, to Pinson Curtis? Were they all kind of sink or swim moments, as opposed to you being integrated in any formal way?
Yes, but I think those were the times. And to be honest, it was amazing going to Pinson's. Then Pinson Curtis was a fresh merger of a Leeds firm with a Birmingham firm, and they decided to open a London office, and they recruited a managing partner from Linklaters, I think.
Yeah.
And then they recruited 15 specialists, and we literally all sat there in the boardroom with a pad and a pen. Back then, computers they didn't carry them to every meeting. They were kind of desktops. And that was super exciting. Because I'm an extrovert, I recognize that not everyone doesn't feel comfortable over their skis, right? Or to dare and to lose your footing. But I've always found that quite exciting. And so, I thrive in that environment, but I don't think that is what's best for long-term success for laterals or law firms. When so many good people I've seen leave firms who are really good partners, and it hasn't worked. And I just think it's too trite for law firms to say, well, they weren't any good. Or you've got to ask yourself, what was it about our environment that was unwelcoming? When a law firm has a very, very strong culture, as all of the law firms that I've been in have had, I always feel it has a bit of a surface tension. It's like there's amazing photographs of breaststrokers where their head's about to come out of the water, but the water is still, not broken. And I feel like with firms with very strong culture, you have to lean in, and you have to keep leaning in. You don't just lean in once. And so what I have seen is people get quite dejected. The persistence that's required to carry on, because you're trying to permeate something that's very strong, and you want to change things, but you have to change it from within. And so I do feel that this talent is wasted frequently in the profession. And I think that's going to be much more challenging as people choose not to be in the law for their whole career. I realize that, we're currently as a sector massively oversubscribed from people who think they want to be lawyers. But, to coin a cliche, it is a marathon, not a sprint. And the amount of talent that the profession loses before the partner level is enormous, but also at the partner level with people burning out. And I think we have to find more sustainable ways of keeping hold of talent. You've got to start looking under stones and looking for atypical talent and thinking, as I said earlier, well, if I don't see value in you, that's my fault. How am I going to get it out of you?
Do you think there's enough self-analysis done by law firms when, as you say, either people who've come up to partnership and made partner and then leave, or laterals who've come in who should have worked out by all objective metrics? In your experience, having been there, was there an ability of the law firms to think not only of the huge amount of money which has been potentially wasted, but just to see what could we have done better? Or was it more or less, well, they just weren't good enough?
I think those kinds of dissections are ad hoc and not systematic, in the same way that I feel obviously law firms are huge buyers of coaching services in the market, but how much is there systematic feedback of the themes that coaches are hearing in private settings around firms that actually would be of enormous benefit to the law firm if they were fed back, obviously on an anonymous basis? That would really require law firm leaders to sit down and say, okay, well, there's something going on over there in that part of the firm that perhaps the sunlight hasn't quite reached. So I think there is quite a lot of work still to do on that.
Yeah, no, look, you're right. And certainly in my, integration coaching activities, where if there are themes from a variety of people, then I feel more comfortable mentioning those to the law firms with the agreement of those people, as long as they can't be individually recognized. But I agree that is tricky. And one of the things I do try and talk to the firms is that, they're recruiting laterals, not just to make the laterals get absorbed into the law firm's culture, but for the culture to change for the better and to learn from some of the things that laterals have got to offer, which are better than their existing firm's culture in relation to those issues. And I find that very tricky.
You've said that right. Absolutely.
It's a very difficult process, but that's how cultures change for the better, isn't it? Okay. So moving on to a couple more questions about yourself. So what's the best moment you've had as a partner, and the worst? And the worst can't be you not making managing partner.
I had many bad moments when I saw, to keep with the theme that we're discussing, partners who I thought had enormous value that other people in the firm couldn't recognize. I took responsibility for that in the sense of, okay, well, why are we not selling this practice enough? How have we failed? Those are dark days. There was a time, a long time ago, when one of the firms I was in did a redundancy exercise that was really difficult. In the financial crisis. And I learned from that you have to really just have to speak with integrity. You have to be completely straight with people. People find that very, very hard. I guess my employment law training probably made that easier for me than perhaps it might for some other partners. And the best day was pretty much every day I was a partner at A&O. It was brilliant.
Okay. Excellent. So you kind of narrow it down slightly to less than 20 years.
Really, I just feel enormous privilege to have been at that firm, although I did particularly enjoy living in California, because my only regret in my whole life is not being American. I've had a house in Wyoming for a long, long time. And so that was a real high point. And coming off to such a low point of not being elected managing partner, it was great. And I met some wonderful people that we were recruiting at the time. It was fantastic.
Good. So no cases that stick in your mind that you can mention, which you're publicly known about?
The problem with employment law is generally it's all behind doors. I mean, I've had some fabulous cases. There was a huge case, very widely reported, where I chased an individual who had stolen some trading algorithms off a client around the world, literally. Injunctions flying in every jurisdiction possible. Lots of consideration of whether the individual involved was an agent of a foreign power.
Oh, wow.
It was really an amazing case. And in the end, the individual was prosecuted and went to jail. I don't want to say I had satisfaction of that, but certainly that case and the ability, if you have a client of not unlimited means, but a client for whom stealing confidential information is just like the worst possible offense, to really kind of flex your muscles as a lawyer and to be really creative to say, okay, well, what can we do when someone doesn't have a limit on saying, well, this is your budget, just like go and do whatever needs to do. That was a high point.
No, I can imagine. Okay, that's really interesting. What did you appreciate about being a partner until you became one, and how has that influenced you in mentoring future potential successful partners, or maybe ones that were potential then but now are successful?
You're always on show as a partner. Someone once gave me that piece of advice a long, long time ago, and it's very, very smart piece of advice. I mean, personal brand, I think, as a partner in the market, internal with firms and outside, is very, very important. And of course, personal brand is what people say about you, not what you say about yourself. So I think some consideration, more strategic consideration by partners as to how they get in that mix and how they try to influence how people see them is very, very important, including out with clients in the market. So I think that's really important. I think I didn't appreciate that. I think I've mentioned this point before, but I don't think I fully understood. And I think this is a bit of a shift for people who are newly promoted to partner, that it is all for one and one for all, and that you have to put the partnership first, and that you need to be really mindful of the clarity of your intentions and how you are engaging with your fellow partners. I think that is super, super important.
It's interesting, isn't it? So sorry to interrupt you, because you mentioned the personal branding, but there's a fine line, isn't there, between the personal branding and the team playing attributes. I mean, if you go too much down the personal branding, that can alienate a lot of your other partners. Or
no, you're not missing the point. That's why I made the point that your intentions have to be really, really clear. This is the point I was talking about earlier when I said, somebody's profound reputation can help everybody. But people have to understand that you're doing it for the right reasons. And they're not going to just assume that. So you have to be really, really clear about it, I think. I think the other thing that is very hard to deal with as a partner, when suddenly you're now, sitting at a hierarchy in a firm that was built sort of on 19th century principles to deal with the intergenerational challenges. These are the generations that have grown up group learning. They've been friends with their parents. They are really concerned about the environment and purpose and all kinds of things. And they come into an office environment in the legal sector and they see hierarchies, rules that are obsessed with inputs like timesheets and presenteeism and not outputs. Very, very difficult to motivate those people unless you really try to empathize and try to put yourself in their shoes and try to work out what leadership style you need to flex to get the best out of those people, because they want to give you their best. But they find that kind of environment so constricting. That is a huge challenge for the profession. And I think partners, and I think every partner will tell you this, is that they lose their associate friends when they make a partner. And that's a moment, right? It's a moment to recognize the power of hierarchy, the power that you have. That goes back to the point I was making earlier about casting that leadership shadow. You don't want to completely have an eclipse.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. As a recruiter, I saw it in both ways, because sometimes when someone big left a firm and there was a tremendous worry about what was going to happen, actually that was the best thing that could have ever happened. It was like the flowers suddenly could see the sunlight, and all these other partners just sort of sprung up, and 2 or 3 years later people were like, well, why were we worried? And then sometimes, because the person who left was all encompassing, there was no seeds to germinate underneath. So I can certainly see what you're saying there.
But when that happens, you have to deal with the sort of PTSD of the team, right? When that happens. And I think one of the things you can do as a junior partner is try to develop a range of styles, that fits whether you are introverts, extroverts, who you're managing. If you think about neurodiversity generally, I mean, I guess to put it colloquially, I'd say, look, how many dialects can you learn to speak? Because I think that's really, really important.
Yeah, no, okay, that's very interesting. What key piece of advice have you been given? I mean, you've mentioned a few pieces of advice. What key pieces of advice have you been given, and also in your career, which have had a positive or negative effect on your success? And also, what mentors have you had in your career that you can either name or describe if you don't want to name them?
I think I always found the biggest learning experiences to be people who I feel do their jobs really badly, because because I've always felt, well, okay, there's a learning moment to go and do something in a completely different way. Of course, you don't make their mistakes. You just go and make a whole lot more of your own. But I do, when people ask me about mentors, I always default to thinking about the people who I thought was so dreadful and how I could be different. But I think the best piece of advice I was ever given was always take the opportunity to broaden your network. And, that's quite hard. And the older you get and the more commitments you get, and the fact that, sometimes these jobs are so overwhelming that you just want to go home, pour a glass of wine, put your pajamas on and watch Slow Horses. But actually, you really should never pass up an opportunity to broaden your network. And perhaps we'll come back to this, Stephen. It's so important when you eventually leave the profession as to how you then leverage that network. So it's really, really important.
We are definitely going to come back to that. And I think the networking point that goes for not just being a law firm partner, but anything in professional services. And I always used to say to the recruiters that I used to manage that there's barely ever been a coffee, even if I was dreading having it, which doesn't spring up something that you can act on. And I think in the pandemic and maybe remote meetings have changed that for the worse, because they're much more difficult on a remote meeting, on a Zoom or a Teams meeting, to actually get underneath the surface of someone and get to know them a little bit. Would you think you'd agree with that?
I don't think it's impossible. And I think we all have to learn to be virtual and hybrid leaders. I mean, virtual, I don't find very difficult. I find, you have to see beyond the camera. You have to imagine that you're in a room full of people. And of course, I had the leadership challenge of kind of running the global litigation practice that I was running during COVID. And that was a moment of, such discomfort for people, and to really support people and how to work out how to do that. Hybrid, I think, brings a real challenge because it creates an in and out crowd.
Yes.
And, I understand that people's attraction to it and not being not wanting or feeling that's necessary to come to work every day. I get that completely. Sorry, come to the office every day, I should say. But I do think there are some dangers in hybrid that we haven't really worked through, because fundamentally the people who created, whatever we took out of COVID was just triage. It wasn't strategic. And so I do think we still have to come to grips with hybrid working.
If you look at law firms and banks, I mean, obviously they're trying to get people back in the office more and more. So do you think that's a good thing or not?
No, I don't. I feel that's I think that's like the death rattle of the old way of doing things. I'm not saying I've got the solution, but the solution is not to do that, because it will just drive talent out of firms. And that's not to say I don't massively appreciate the osmotic effect of teaching, of being in the office. I get all of that, and it's really important. But I think you don't build trust, because clearly if you feel everyone has got to be within shouting distance of your office, you obviously don't trust people. And I think you've got to look at outputs, not inputs.
Yeah, I know you've mentioned that a couple of times. That's really interesting, the way you've put that.
And I just think you've got to treat people how they want to be treated, not how you want to treat them. I mean, that is one of my absolute non-negotiable kind of, markers for behaviours. And I think that's really, really important. And that's how you get the best out of people.
Okay. So looking ahead, and we started to kind of look ahead a little bit in this, but so what factors, market or otherwise, are going to affect partner or firm success in the future?
That's a really great question, actually. And in fact, you gave me a bit of warning about that question. And I've got some thoughts about this, because I think we're at such an inflection point in the sector. The first thing, I think, I've alluded to this before, it's like the complexities of the age. Clients are no longer just looking for legal services. Lawyers have got to be part of creating solutions for complex problems. I mean, solutions that extend way, way beyond the law. I mean, legal education is broadly the same as it always was. I've said that. And so where in the profession do we see a really systematized, collective sense of law firms cooperate to teaching people all the skills they need now to be a client lawyer? And I think for the good of the profession, I think there needs to be a lot more directed to that. Clients want lawyers to help them have sustained success, financial success. And so I think that also is pushing firms, whether they realize it or not, to collaborate with one another for the benefit of mutual clients. I see a few green shoots on that, but I think the profession's going to have to really kind of grapple with that. I think the second thing that's really going to affect future success, and perhaps we're having a regressive moment right now, but this point about employees believing that they can force their firms into taking positions, that they are emboldened, they know that ticking a box is going to have very negative, ultimately commercial consequences. I think the sands of shifting under the classic kind of Friedman shareholder philosophy. You've got to be thinking about your other stakeholders. You've got to be a revered member of the community. You've got to think about the environment. You can't just reflect client values now. You've got to have your own set of values as a law firm. And sometimes you can imagine they're going to conflict with client values. And how you deal with that is going to require quite a difficult balancing act. But, if you believe, for example, in a diverse society, you have to stand up and be counted. You have to choose what to speak up on. And speak up on it. And will you suffer some short-term damage? Maybe. But I absolutely believe you'll suffer real long-term damage if you don't. And so, Stephen, and my final point on kind of like my worries about, or at least my observations on what is going to really affect future success, is this concept of leveraging the team. I've returned to it time and again about, how you get fabulous talent to fabulously perform. And I think anyone listening to this needs to hardwire this into their brain. No lawyer anywhere ever gets incited or enthusiastic about supporting an idea they've not had a part in formulating. And so I do think that the dialogue between partners and other key members of staff needs to be mutual, respectful. It's not the partner job to be the smartest person in the room. The partner job is to be a catalyst. Back to Jurgen Klopp again. But it is. The partner job is to be a coach and catalyst of the talent around them.
Wow. No, I mean, that's quite profound. I wonder how many of your your fellow previous partners would agree with that. Hopefully, quite.
I'm used to not being. I'm used to not being agreed with, Stephen.
Exactly, as the rebellious streak coming out again. So, just one final question about you. I mean, now you've stopped. You're not as partner anymore. You've made the positive decision to leave.
Mm-hmm.
So, how has it been off ramping from being a successful partner in a global law firm?
It is hard when you've done one thing your whole life, and that's be in the law. It's not easy. I did have a moment when I read Ibarra's book, Working Identity, because the orthodoxy, and I spoke to a few people and they said, well, you just need to decide, what it is that you're really passionate about. And the thing is, I have a massive passion for life. I've got so many interests. I could imagine 20 different versions of my future. So reading her book, where her best advice is, look, forget all of that orthodoxy. Start trying things. If you don't like them, stop them. Take a fork in the road. And that was enormously helpful. And in fact, it hasn't taken me very long to have a completely different perspective now. And it's fascinating. I'm doing some strategic work through the business you mentioned earlier with a former client and set of clients. I've got my not-for-profits in the artistic sector. I'm absolutely passionate about performing and visual arts. I have, like you, become a qualified coach. And I'm quite keen to use to kind of, I feel with coaching, it's such a saturated market that you have to have quite a USP. And I think my USP is going to be combining it with employment law and looking for kind of remedial coaching, which I think many coaches don't like to do because they feel that people are not invested in it. But I've got some ideas about how I can do that. And I haven't absolutely given up. I don't want to be a lawyer anymore, but I haven't given up working full time. But at the moment, I'm working probably 3 days a week and having the time of my life. Excellent. Well, that's good to hear. So we end these interviews with 2 questions, which is from another podcast, and I'm sorry to have stolen their 2 questions. And some of them you've answered a little bit in the course of this, but I'm still going to ask them. So what are your 3 non-negotiable behaviours for you and your team to ensure success? That's the first one. Treat people how they want to be treated, not how you want to treat them. That's one. No inner cliques. It can't be Malaga or Siberia. When you're working with a team, you have to create a safe space for everyone, because that's what's going to win, and that's what's going to deliver the best client solution. Okay. And a third one, be curious. Okay. I think you've got to have a growth mindset. And my last one would be, I think we're all afflicted as human beings by a desire to be liked. But I think if you let that get ahead of itself, I think you make decisions on the basis of whether you're going to be liked or not. That's not important. What's important is to be respected. And I think if one can liberate oneself from the need to be liked in a working environment, it tends to give you a platform for greater success. Okay. And what's your one golden rule to be a successful partner? Courage. You did say that before? I did. My Kierkegaard quote. Yes. Dare. Consistent. Dare. That is excellent. Look, Karen, that's been absolutely fantastic, really fascinating. And I want to thank you for being our guest on Beyond Billables, Lessons from Top Law Firm Partners. It's been really fascinating to hear your views on what makes a successful partner and much more. So we're very grateful. We're glad that you made the time to come on the podcast. I was really happy to be asked, Stephen. Thank you. And it's lovely to catch up with you again. Yeah, indeed. So join us on our next episode of Beyond Billables, Lessons from Top Law Firm Partners, where we'll have another top partner who will share their secrets of success. See you next time.